Episode 230, Ken Snyder, Executive Director of the Shingo Institute.
What we discovered was that each of the data jockeys had their own way of doing things. You know, they're all experts, they're all smart, they all think their way is the best way.
I'm Mark Graban. This is My Favorite Mistake. In this podcast, you'll hear business leaders and other really interesting people talking about their favorite mistakes. Because we all make mistakes, but what matters is learning from our mistakes instead of repeating them over and over again. So this is the place for honest reflection and conversation, personal growth, and professional success. Visit our website at myfavoritemistakepodcast.com. To learn more about Ken, the Shingo Institute, and more, look for links in the show notes or go to markgraban.com/mistake230. As always, thanks for listening. Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm Mark Graban. Our guest today is Ken Snyder. He is the Executive Director of the Shingo Institute and a Senior Lecturer at Utah State University. So Ken's been the Executive Director of the Institute since 2015. Earlier in his life and career, he developed an interest in Japanese business practices while living in Japan while he was a student. This led him to major in Japanese history at the University of Utah, and he pursued an MBA from the Harvard Graduate School of Business with the intent of working with a Japanese business that was expanding in the U.S. He joined the Jon M Huntsman School of Business there at Utah State University in 2008. And previously, he was the president of Marketing Communications, Inc., an operating division of Taylor Corporation, where he directed a group of 6 companies and grew revenues from 25 million to over 80 million. So, Ken, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Mark. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, and we have lots to talk about. For the audience, I've known Ken for probably a decade. Mm-hmm. I think since we first crossed paths, and I'm learning and during our prep, and I'm going to learn more during the episode of some of your prior business experience. So it'd be interesting to hear a little bit more of your history and your perspectives.
I've got the scars to go with that business experience too.
Okay. And I know your students and people involved with the Institute are getting to learn and benefit from some of your experiences and scars.
Well, I will talk about one of those because it wasn't until I came to the Institute that I realized the mistake I had made, or the solution anyway to the mistake I had made. And it's one I had pondered for many years. So I'm looking forward to telling that story. Okay, well, good. So that's a good segue into the story and the lessons learned. And so I guess I'll go ahead and tee you up. You're already thinking about it, so I'll let you get right into it. And Ken, what is your favorite mistake? My favorite mistake is maybe not the right word, but you'll see. It's the biggest thing I couldn't figure out at the time, but then later finally understood what I should have done in the moment. But the times I noticed it the most, I was president of a company called Progressive Impressions. It was one of the Taylor Corp companies. Later, I got promoted to be a group president, but this is kind of mid-career. The time period is the 1990s, roughly. And we were a leading database marketing company, and we did provided marketing services for distributed sales networks. So, for example, the agents of insurance companies and the dealers or the value-added retail dealers for large computer companies those were some of our clients. And because in most cases, there were a few cases where Central had a centralized database, the main company that had this distributed sales force. But in most cases, the databases were held by the dealers or the agents or whatever. And so we would, and I'll just use the example of the computer company. They had 6,000 dealers around the world, and we were doing a dealer-oriented marketing piece that was customized to those dealers, but largely funded by corporate headquarters. So our contract was with corporate headquarters. The dealers provided their data to us. And this was before the internet was used for data exchange. So we got, for example, for 6,000 dealers, we got 6,000 either tape, disc, cartridge, you name it, and no consistency at all. And once we landed a contract, the first thing that would happen would be we would do this project onboarding process or system, if you will. And we had a bunch of data jockeys who would then take those 6,000 things so would assign a lead data person who would then accumulate all the data, format it, put it in the right fields, get it all ready so that we could use it to customize the marketing pieces and have all the customer information where the promotional piece was going to go. So what we discovered was that each of the data jockeys had their own way of doing things. They're all experts, they're all smart, they all think their way is the best way, but everybody did it differently. And we thought, this is not good. We need to figure out the best way to do it. And so we got them all together and kind of forced what's the best way to do this step? What's the best way to do this step? What's the best? And went through step by step by step and had them all agree to it. We documented it, created this standard work document for onboarding data. And then I walk away thinking, we've made an improvement. Come to find out, a couple months later, I'm sitting in a meeting and one of the data jockeys running the project or onboarding mentioned something that wasn't part of the standard work that we'd talked about. And I go, I thought we did it that way. And he said, oh, no, I don't do it that way. And so then I started to go back and look and see what the other guys were doing too. And pretty much everybody had gone back to their original way of doing everything, their own way. So the standard work we created was no longer standard. We were back to the old way, which was every individual did it their own way.
Well, when you say went back to, it sounds like it really never moved away from
it. Never moved away.
Okay. Yeah.
It never. So I started thinking, we did this big effort to try to standardize and make it better for everybody. But each of them had this opinion that it suboptimized their ideal way of doing things, even though somebody else's ideal was very different than their ideal. And it got me thinking, why did we revert back?
Or why was it never adopted? Why did we never change?
Why did we never change? I thought we had decided that we were going to do it this new way.
So how many of those 6,000 people had input with you in designing that new approach? You probably talked to all 6,000.
This is a group. This is a group of about 10 to 15 people. Okay, so it's not this. We're getting data from 6,000 sources, but there's only 10 to 15 people who are trying to get them to do this data onboarding the same way. So but why didn't they adopt this new way of doing it? This wasn't the only time I experienced thinking we had made an improvement and not having that improvement stick. And I started noticing it more and more that it would go through some sort of Kaizen event. We would improve something and then I'd go back later and people are doing it the old way.
And Kaizen, for those who don't know, is a Japanese word that would you agree it means basically improvement or
improvement? Yeah, we went through some sort of improvement activity, and the improvement didn't stick. So thank you, Mark. I should use the English word.
It's okay.
So I noticed this pattern a few more times, and I never could quite understand what it was about the improvement efforts that we had made and why they didn't stick when I thought everybody was bought in. I thought everybody had agreed this is a better way for everybody. And then you go back and you find out. So I also noticed, though, that I always found out after I had seen it happening the old way, after I thought we had decided on a new way. That was a consistent pattern. And this one kind of stuck with me for a long time. Okay. And I thought about it off and on over a course of many years. I get promoted. I then joined the faculty of the university. And I'm still wondering, what was it that made it not stick? I never quite got it. Fast forward to I think it was 2017. I am sitting in one of our Shingo conferences listening to a presentation by Brent Allen, who was an executive vice president for Lifetime Products. And we had invited Brent to give a presentation. He says, we've been doing some interesting stuff with systems design. And I thought, oh, I'd like to see what they're doing. I know they're experimenting in ways that would be interesting for me to learn about and see what it means for the Shingo Institute and all of that. And I'm sitting there and he goes, we found that we made we'd make lots of changes and then we'd go back and people had not really changed and they're doing it the old way, or they'd tried it for a few days and then gone back the old way, tried it for a few weeks, gone back the old way. He's talking exactly about this problem. I go, this is really interesting. And he says, what we found is the following things need to be in place in order for something to stick. He says, first of all, you've got to change the system. And I thought, okay, what do you mean by that, Brent? So I'm thinking, what do you mean by that, Brent? And he goes, you got to change the system so it's easy for them to do it the new way and hard for them to do it the old way. You got to change the nature of the work. And then that was the first thing he said. And I went, okay, I thought we kind of did address that. And that was part of the reason of making the change, but maybe we didn't make it harder. And then he said, though, and this is the part that really caught it. He said, we found that we needed to do, and he used the word audit, and we don't use that now in our systems design workshop that we have at the Shingo Institute, but we use the word feedback. There needs to be some sort of a feedback loop, some way to go check to see and make sure everybody's doing it the way that you've now decided the new standard work will be done.
Yeah.
And it was like that one kind of really hit home, because in every case I could think of it, I found out about it either through walking around and seeing, or in a meeting and somebody says they're doing it. It was like, wait a minute, that's not what we decided how we're going to do that. I found out kind of accidentally afterwards, not purposefully making sure it was being done the new way, but finding out accidentally by observing but random observation and or in a meeting or something like that.
You get a report of somebody admits.
Yeah, somebody just says they're going to do it the way they're going to do it, and wait a minute, that doesn't fit with the way we decided we're going to do it. So it dawned on me that in every system change we made, for example, in this onboarding system, we may have documented the new way to do it, but we never built in any kind of a feedback loop or an audit function, a way of ensuring that. And then he says, what we found, this is going back to what Brent said in his presentation. We found that at first, even when you try to make it easy for people to do the right thing and hard for them to do the wrong thing, it's still easier for them to do it the old way.
It's usually more comfortable.
It's more comfortable and it's easier for them because they're used to it. And until they get used to this new way, there's a period of adjustment where you really need that feedback loop, where this is harder than I thought it was going to be because, or I didn't know how to do this, so I went and did it my old, whatever. And without that feedback loop, you don't get that information coming back to you, so you can say, how can we make it easier for you? Or what kind of training do you need to be able to make this work better? And I just assumed we'd agreed on it, so it was done.
Yeah.
And that was a mistake. That's where really the mistake was, is in not thinking there needs to be some follow-up. There needs to be some follow-up. There needs to be some feedback loop. We need to go watch and observe to make sure it's being implemented. And I'm sitting there in Brent's thing. I'm going, there was a real aha moment for me, because this had bugged me for years. And I get asked all the time in the Shingo Institute, we just make improvements, but they don't stick.
Right. You're not the only one making this mistake. I've made that mistake.
It's a question people ask all the time too, is why don't we make improvements, but they don't stick? And to me, this was the thing that I was missing. Now, maybe something is missing in the way other people do improvements and the way they implement them. But what I found is it's really common that we don't make it easier. We make an improvement, but we make it hard for them to do the new way, and it's still easier for them to do the old way. Or even if we make it easy for them, there's something missing that makes it easy for them. And so like an obstacle, they don't have the training. They don't know how to do that. Oh, this is the procedure, but I don't know how to do that. So I'm going to do it the way I know how to do it. And then there's the, just the comfort that comes from doing it the way you know how to do it the most. And you've got to have some sort of feedback as to, no, you can't do it that way, or put up an obstacle to make it hard for them to do it the wrong way was something I'd never thought of before when Brent talked about that. And so it was like so many ahas in there about how can we make it stick, but it all came down to designing the system the right way. You gotta design the work differently. You've got to put some sort of feedback or audit loop in there. You've got to go and observe and verify. And you've got to document if there's things you figure out in that process, you got to document it so everybody knows it and you can share it with all the other 12, 10 to 15 data jockeys who are supposed to be making the same improvement at the same time. You've got to get them together and talk about the problems they're having as they do it too. And we didn't do any of that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it sounds like, there were things you did right? I mean, it's not like you designed it and that it was a unilateral decision. Like you engaged people.
And but it still didn't stick.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, there are times where people will nod their head and agree, but they might think, well, that makes Ken happy. Okay, I'll agree. But I am sure there's some of that going on too, Mark. Do it my way. And I'm not saying there's anything nefarious there, but no. I mean, it sounds like one of these situations, these are tough to navigate where like there's a difference maybe between authority and influence. Like it sounds like you needed to influence rather than having authority of thou shalt do it this way, or like, that sort of authority based way that some people try to drive change, which also doesn't always work because people will find ways around that authority. But you mentioned the question I was going to ask was about the word audit, where I could see there are times where people think the word audit sounds very kind of authority based.
Yes.
Like we're now, okay, we're going to audit you. And if you're not doing this way, there are going to be consequences. And
it becomes compliance.
Yeah.
So Brent used the word audit. They build an audit function into their systems in Lifetime. But so when we worked with this, we did more research in systems and did a lot of, I tried, and Sean tried to read a whole bunch of systems books just to get up to speed on systems design, system components. Deming wrote a lot about systems, but he never really clarified what are the elements you have to have in a system. And, there's a lot of confusion about it. But we eventually did that research effort and put it together into a systems design workshop that we launched. And in the process, Brent had retired from Lifetime, and we brought him in as a faculty fellow for the Shingo Institute. And he helped us. He joined our group on a regular basis and helped us design the systems design workshop. And in the course of discussion about the term audit, we decided that's not the right kind of connotation to use. It does imply compliance, not feedback. And so we said, what we need is a feedback loop. And that's what we do. That's the word we used in the workshop now. Is it doesn't have to be an audit, but that's the word that they used at Lifetime at the time. But it was I used the word today just to give you an idea of somebody's got to go check on it though.
Sure, I agree there. Yeah.
Okay, so what we decided as we talk about what's ideal state is the leader, the person who leads the system. So in the case of it should be the IT manager who looks over the case of our system. The ideal of what we should have done was the IT manager regularly goes and checks to make sure that the people are following the standard work. And if there's people who are having difficult time following the standard work, get them together and say, what's the problem here? And how can we fix it? How can we make it easier for you to do it this new way that will keep it standard between everybody? That's the kind of feedback loop we didn't have in the system. But when you make it, what I learned is when you make a significant change like this and you standardize everything across a group of people, that there's going to be some hiccups. And you've got to have a way of addressing those hiccups on a timely basis, and then, ironing out those issues so it's easy for everybody to do it the new way, which is, we've all agreed, would be a better way if it actually worked, but they're having the struggle making it work. And then they just give up because of that struggle, and they drop back. And you've got to be able to address that in real time.
You've got to help people through the learning curve and the discomfort. And doing something a new way might be at first less efficient.
Yes.
Until people power through the learning curve. And there's all kinds of business dynamics where, I'm not saying this applied to your situation, but I think of similar situations where people are sort of being forced to adopt a new way, and then they're being punished for that short-term inefficiency through performance measures or incentives. Or you could say, well, that's unfair. Like a constructive feedback loop would maybe help leaders say, okay, we need to give some allowance for this learning curve and working our way through the change curve to the new efficiency, instead of giving up and saying, oh, this is slower, it didn't work. Well, maybe we just haven't gotten through the change yet.
Right. And that's exactly what we were missing, was that follow through, if you will. Yeah. So
and that idea of a feedback loop, and it's not just the word, but I think the mindset and the principles behind it. I think of one of the best leaders I've worked with in healthcare, Jim, who was the director of the lab at Children's Medical Center in Dallas, who would use language. He would talk about getting that feedback, and we were working to introduce standardized work and improve processes into his hospital laboratory. He was a student of Peter Senge and systems thinking, and he was a really thoughtful leader who really cared about his people. And he would talk about and sort of distinguish, I think use the word barriers. Jim would talk about making sure you really hear what he called legitimate barriers. And that sounds a little judgmental, but I think he was trying to separate the things that we need to address to be helpful versus, let's say, just the complaints of, this is new, this is uncomfortable, versus we need to tweak the standardized work in it to be even better. Like he was sort of trying to separate and focus people toward like feedback that could help us improve, as opposed to complaints.
Yes. And sometimes complaints do give us as leaders insights into where we, let's look at the complaint. What's the reason behind the complaint? Usually there's a good reason behind the complaint.
Yeah. And he wasn't trying to be dismissive.
Right. Don't be dismissive. That's the point I want to make, is there's a reason somebody is having trouble with a certain issue, and they may not have a solution. But they do want to report, I got a problem here.
Yeah. Well, and part of that feedback loop, we may need to ask why a number of times. So if somebody I think if we dig into the quote unquote complaint. So if somebody says on some level, I don't like this new way, I don't want to do it. Well, instead of saying, no, you have to, like you could dig and well, tell me more about that. Why don't you like it? Is there, I think sometimes leaders don't dig beneath the surface to figure out then what is the legitimate concern.
And I've found that the better trained people are, the better their ideas, the more their complaints turn into suggestions on how to improve, because now they have a way of looking at it with the training that they have of this is a problem. It goes from this is a problem, or I'd like to solve this problem this way. And, give me the resources or give me the time or whatever to do it. And so I think a great way to bridge that is raise the skills of your people, because then they can contribute in more valuable ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Ken, I appreciate you sharing that story and your reflections and what you've learned and how the Shingo Institute helped you. I've attended many of the Shingo conferences, and there's always great speakers, with insights and new ideas and things that are really helpful. So, tell the audience a little bit then about the Shingo Institute, and in particular, I think connected to these topics of mistakes and preventing mistakes and learning and improving, the namesake of the Shingo Institute. Tell everyone about some of the history there.
And that's great. I love to do that. So the Shingo Institute is a program within the Huntsman School of Business at Utah State. It's named after Shigeo Shingo, who was one of the people who was a father, if you will, of the Toyota production system. He never worked for Toyota, but he was hired by Toyota and worked for them as a consultant over the course of roughly 27 years. He taught a quarterly P course, productivity course, a week-long workshop of lean systems and tools. And Toyota would cycle about 30 people every quarter through Shingo's workshop. And so over the course of those 27 years, he taught about 3,000 to 4,000 Toyota leaders in this workshop. So he knows from that experience, he knew a lot of the Toyota people, and he did a lot of outside work with Toyota as well. He, in the course of working with Toyota and with other clients, he developed many of the terminologies that we have in the lean world today. For example, Poka-yoke is a Shingoism. He's the one who came up with the term, how do you error-proof so you don't pass a mistake that's made down the line to the next step in the process. You error-proof it so that you prevent that error from becoming a mistake and a defect, if you will.
Yeah.
He also developed the thinking behind and the terminology that we use when we use the word SMED, or single minute exchange of die. Or more commonly, we now just use the term quick changeover. How do you get to where you can have a quick changeover so you don't shut down your production line or some other process that may be, as you go through the change, everything gets disrupted. How do you make that changeover as short as possible and keep the flow of the process going as much as possible?
Mm-hmm.
Those are just, he also developed the concept of one-piece flow. That he called it non-stock production, but non-stock production and one-piece flow are essentially the same thing. We've renamed it a little bit from the way he described it, but he's the one who came up with the methodology, the thinking behind it, if you will, and wrote a book about it. And so he's just one of those pioneers that was very influential, both within Toyota but also in the broader world. Over the course of his life, he wrote 17 different books. I've got the full set of them up here. Incidentally, this is the Shingo library of books, if you will.
The original Japanese.
And the original Japanese, many of them first edition copies. Many of them with his notes for the second edition, incidentally. Things that he wanted to change for the second edition, he'd make in the first edition.
Some Kaizen between the editions, yes.
And his son, Mitsuo Shingo, which I think you've probably met.
I have.
Gave the full set of books to us from his father's library for the Institute to keep. And I have the privilege of keeping it right behind my desk for easy access. But what a great leader and thinker in the world of lean, a true pioneer, and we're honored to be named after him. In 1988, we invited Shigeo Shingo to come to our university, and one of my predecessors, Vern Bueller, had arranged for him to receive an honorary doctorate. And when he came for the ceremony and in that induction ceremony to become a doctor, if you will, Vern Bueller and Norman Bodek, the three of them got together for dinner. And over dinner, they asked Mr. Shingo if it was okay if we used his name to start a prize. And Shingo said yes, he would be honored. And he says, the initial focus of the prize was to be on North American manufacturing. And he said, so the idea was to recognize manufacturers in North America for the great work they do in adopting your teachings and Toyota production system and that. And he said, the world needs American manufacturing to be strong. And if having a prize will help that, then yes, please use my name to help make American manufacturing strong. Well, it's grown beyond manufacturing, and it's grown beyond North America. We now have recipients in over 30 countries of the Shingo Prize or a Shingo Medallion, and it has spread to other industries as well. Right now, I would say about 20 to 30% of our recipients are North American manufacturers, and we have lots of other recipients in other parts of the world and lots of recipients in other industries besides manufacturing. It's become a true global standard, which I think Shingo would be happy about. I don't think he wanted us to limit our influence to a certain geography and a certain industry. He would be happy with how we're learning to apply those principles in other ways, in other industries, and in other countries.
Yeah. And this was happening at a time when, Toyota, obviously with Japanese roots, was expanding with facilities, not just North America, but other countries. And I one thing I admire about Toyota is their willingness to share and help other companies and society. Toyota has a group, I know you're familiar with, Ken, TSSC, that works with not just their own suppliers, but with hospitals and with nonprofits and companies in areas unrelated, because they want to share their knowledge. And, as I've heard from companies, I interviewed somebody on this podcast, Mike Kading, who runs a company that designs and builds and rents apartments.
Oh,
they worked with TSSC, and as he described the process, there's this opportunity for Toyota to learn from the process of helping another company, right? So I'm not surprised that Mr. Shingo, even with his indirect connection to Toyota, had that interest in sharing and helping with others.
Yes, and it was wonderful. I never met Shingo. He passed away in early 1990s, and I wasn't involved with the Shingo Institute then. But I did get a chance to know his son very well. Unfortunately, he passed away just a couple of months ago. But really wonderful man, and he went to worked for Toyota for 42 years before he hit mandatory retirement age, and then started getting more involved with us and others that in our network around the world. And I know he's been a huge influence. And, to us, he was kind of like a living brand, if you know what I mean. He's somebody who embodies all the things we're trying to teach, has all this experience of what we're trying to teach, and has the name to go along with it. So.
It's a fascinating turn how it was not just the family connection to his father, but the fact that he worked for Toyota and ran Toyota's business in China.
Yes. He was in China for 13 years. Overall, and he ran actually 3 different aspects of their business in China over the course of that. He's the very first production plant which made minibuses, and then he was put in charge of their next major investment, which was the Hino truck division, building a truck plant, and then he was in charge of the research center. So he had a couple of different roles in China, and then he worked with the China office when he was in Japan. That was part of what got him assigned to run the first startup there in the first place. So lots of experience in China.
Yeah. And I'm grateful. I likewise never got to meet Shigeo Shingo, but I did get to meet Ritsuo Shingo through attendance at Shingo conferences, and our mutual friend, Norm Bodak, who has also sadly passed away in recent years. But the opportunity to not only hear him speak, but to talk informally with him and to then have a connection. And I'll put a link in the show notes. I think about 2 years ago, was able to have him as my guest on the podcast I do about lean manufacturing.
Oh, good.
And there's just a lot of great stories and wisdom, captured there. So I'm very, very grateful for that, and all the opportunities for learning and meeting great people that I've had personally through the Shingo Institute.
Good.
So a public thank you.
There's a little bit of the history of the Shingo Institute, the prize. We've add a little bit to the history. We found that a lot of prize recipients weren't able to sustain excellence over time after
There's that
receiving the
challenge
Shingo
again.
Prize. Yeah, and I'm sure there's some people out there who are going, yeah, us too, or whatever. It's hard to keep that continuous improvement, keep moving forward. But we did some research in the early 2000s into why was that happening? Why were organizations getting to a Shingo Prize level and then deteriorating in their performance after that? And that's in 2008 published what we now call the Shingo model. We had a model before, an assessment model before that it consisted of systems, tools, and results. And that's what kind of we thought people were able to sustain that, but it wasn't sustainable. Something was clearly missing. And when we dove into it and researched it, we figured out that we're missing some important pieces around behavior. The companies that kept getting better and better are the ones that had changed their focus from results to behaviors. And I'll just give a quick example. One of the companies we visited, a Shingo Prize recipient organization, they kept getting better and better on safety. They were measuring how many safety catches there were and how quickly they addressed those safety reports and how quickly they resolved them so that nobody could ever get hurt that way. And they were measuring that. And then they said to us, we don't have to worry about people getting hurt or losing time, time lost because of injury, because we don't have any injuries. And we know if we do the things up front, we can prevent those injuries from happening. So we don't have to worry about measuring injuries. We just worry about preventing them. And that was a really impactful thing to us, that seeing that kind of action by many organizations, those preventive behaviors, got us thinking about in the model, how can we create this behavior, this culture of preventive behaviors? And so when 2008, we published, the other thing that we found is those organizations could always answer the question, why? We'd ask them, why did you do this? And they would give us a very clear answer. And why did you do that? And we collected all those whys into what we call the guiding principles. We phrased it in the form of an action verb followed by an important topic, like respect as being the action verb, every individual. Because if you don't, then people won't feel included. They won't get engaged. But if they feel respect, now what does respect mean? And we published the new model in 2008 and started assessing the Shingo Prize to that at that point. And then a lot of people said, can you teach us what this means? What do you mean by how do we do this preventive behavior? What are these guiding principles? How can we implement them in our organization? And that's where we started developing the workshops then. So we've been doing the workshops now for about 17 years when we published the new model. And it's been, we think, a very powerful impact, had a very powerful impact on the community and helping raise, everybody together. So that's an important part of our history. I don't want to skip over either.
And not just history, but the current day and
current day.
I'll put a link in the show notes. I'll encourage people to visit the Shingo Institute website to learn about the workshops, the model, the guiding principles is all laid out there. But before we wrap up, Tanya, I'm looking at this list of the guiding principles, and many of these I think are connected to core themes of the My Favorite Mistake podcast.
Yes,
mentioned already: respect every individual. Realizing, for example, look, we're all human. We all make mistakes. That's part of our human nature, I think, to be respected. Leading with humility. Guests who come on here, yourself included, who have the humility to admit a mistake and the strength to admit that mistake and to focus on another principle, seeking perfection, embrace scientific thinking, and then, assure quality at the source. That to me is about mistake proofing, preventing mistakes. There are other guiding principles on the list, but
let me list with regard to this systems thing that where I missed it. To me, it was we didn't focus on the process well enough.
Another principle there.
Another principle. And we didn't
focus on process.
And we did not think systemically. Mm-hmm. We didn't look at the system to say what's missing in the system that's failing.
Yeah.
And those two just jump out at me on this one is, I knew we had done something wrong. I was hopefully humble enough to recognize, I don't know what I'm doing wrong, but I'm doing something wrong.
Yeah.
Took me years to figure out what we did wrong.
Well, but at least you did.
But yes, it was kind of that aha moment that I wanted to share today.
Yeah.
So
yeah, well, and I appreciate you doing that. And these principles are so interconnected. So we think about we're seeking perfection. We're focusing on process. We're assuring quality at the source. But then when something goes wrong, to me, part of respect every individual is we don't blame individuals for systemic problems. Instead of being punitive, we can be helpful. We can connect them into the improvement process to prevent, whether it's other mistakes, other causes of harm. It's really hard. I mean, these are all so entangled.
They are. They're
but intertwined in a good way. Intertwined.
You can't separate them out. If you don't lead with humility, you don't recognize the problem that you may have caused.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't focus on process, you never discover that there's a problem there in the first place, so.
Yeah. And I appreciate the focus of, getting beyond tools to guiding principles, because I think tools can be born from principles. Like, I think, without some of these principles, we wouldn't be driven to use mistake proofing methods, because we would just tell people to be careful and we would punish them when they made a mistake.
Yeah.
But thankfully, we can do better than that. And if we didn't have the tool handed to us, I think, reflecting on these guiding principles would lead us to create some of these tools that Shingo and Toyota and others have created and shared. So, I mean, we can learn from others, but I think it's stronger learning. We also have principles.
Just one personal reflection. I started studying Japanese business practices in the late 1970s as a college student, and then joined a Japanese company in 1980. And I'd learned a lot of the principles just through, for lack of a better word, osmosis, just by living them and doing them and all that. I had never heard them articulated in a way that I could use to teach others. And when the Shingo model, the revision to the Shingo model in 2008 came out, it was like, I was just I was like, this is so great, because this is all the things that I've tried to teach these people all these years, and I've never really had a good framework to use to teach them. And finally, here's something that's out there that I can just kind of use this and say, this is the way to do it. Now, that was when it was actually the year I transitioned out of industry and joined the university. I wish I'd have had it 20 years earlier and had access to it and been able to use it to teach people in my organizations. What am I trying to explain to you? I'm trying to explain, why do we want to have one piece flow? Well, because, and stuff like that. I built a one piece flow factory. Well, pretty close to it, almost perfect, but not quite. It still had some things but I built we went from beginning to end in 20 minutes, to give you an idea. It was a good factory in that regard. And we had very little inventory, but I couldn't explain very well why. And I think they got it just through the same osmosis that I learned, but there wasn't a good way to articulate it and a good way to teach it. It was something they learned over time because we did it. We built it and we did it. And then they got to go, this is better than having all that stacks of inventory that we see in the other factories around here,
Yeah.
But it was wonderful to have a new model, a model that we could use to teach with and help people understand with better what we need to do. So, yeah, I just think very highly of the Shingo model. And when I got a chance, I became an examiner, got involved with the board, then became the executive director, and just love the work we do.
Yeah. Well, that shows, and thank you for the role that you play and continued evolution and growth of the Shingo Institute. The guiding principles are a helpful articulation, because one other thing that comes to mind is the old expression about the goldfish having trouble describing the water that surrounds it in its bowl. I think a lot of people who come up through, I've met a lot of former Toyota people who came up through that system, and there are certain things that are just so implicit. It can be difficult to really clearly articulate. And I think that's where sometimes the benefit of people like a mutual friend, Stephen Spear,
Yes.
or Jeffrey Liker or others, or even Norman Bodek to some extent, right? Outside observers who then, from that perspective, can help frame and articulate ideas that are then, more explicit and transferable.
I've had a chance to interview a bunch of Toyota leaders in Japan, and you ask them about different things Toyota does, and they just kind of give you like they don't have. I've found that the leaders of Toyota who have had to run operations outside of Japan, where they have been forced to try to teach this to their own workforces, like Ritsuo could, understand much better how to explain what Toyota does. The others just lives it. They never had to explain it. It's because that's the way everything already was. And that's the way they learned it, was through this kind of osmosis that I learned it through. And they have a difficult time explaining it. The ones who have experience explaining it are much better at explaining, incidentally.
Well, sure.
Get all these foreigners in my plant, and I got to figure out how to explain why do we do things that way, and they've learned how to do that.
Yeah, and I'm grateful for that, and I know many others are as well. So Ken, I'm grateful for you coming on and being a guest and sharing and modeling, both personally and I think for what the Shingo Institute has done, identifying opportunities for improvement and leaning into reflection, research, learning, evolution. I appreciate that. And I think that sets a great example for others. So thank you.
Thank you. There's a lot of good left to do in the world through lean. Some of the people I know think lean is dead, and I don't think so. We're in especially as we've come out of the pandemic, the organizations that were good at this got better, and the ones that weren't good at this suffered. And it's we need to tell that story better and show the advantages to everybody, that this is a better way to run your organization. You can get better ROI, you can get better quality, you can get better worker engagement, you can have a much more fun time everybody can have a more fun time at their workplace. It's just better in so many ways.
Yeah. Yes. Well, that's a great note to end on. So again, thank you to our guest today, Ken Snyder, Executive Director of the Shingo Institute and Senior Lecturer at Utah State University. Really, really enjoyed it, Ken.
Thanks, Mark.
Well, thanks again to Ken Snyder for being our guest today. To learn more about him and the Shingo Institute at Utah State University, look for links in the show notes or go to markgraven.com/mistake230. Please, if you can, take a second to rate and maybe even review the podcast. As always, I want to thank you for listening. I hope this podcast inspires you to reflect on your own mistakes, how you can learn from them or turn them into a positive. I've had listeners tell me they started being more open and honest about mistakes in their work. And they're trying to create a workplace culture where it's safe to speak up about problems, because that leads to more improvement and better business results. If you have feedback or a story to share, you can email me, myfavoritemistakepodcast@gmail.com. And again, our website is myfavoritemistakepodcast.com.